Okie dokie. Right, okay, welcome then to session 8. So we've only got a few weeks left after this one, so realistically we got this week, you got next week, you're then on half term, no you're not, you're on Easter for 3 weeks, and then we got 2 more taught sessions then towards the end of April. So what I thought we'd start to do this morning is just to kind of go back a bit and think a little bit about what the second assignment for the module is. I'm conscious we've spent quite a lot of time thinking about the in-class test realistically because that came up first. So I just wanted to go back and think a little bit about the second assignment. And now we've got quite a bit of time before this one comes in. I've got to be honest, this comes in Monday the 18th of May, which I think is your last assignment out of the 3 modules that you've got going on at the moment. And I'm also conscious that our last session is Monday the 27th of April, and then we've got a few weeks before then the assignment comes in May. So what we will do is I'm happy to meet up either individually or as a group on campus or on Zoom or Teams between our last session and the assignment coming in. And again, like you did for the first one, you're more than welcome to send drafts as we go through as well. Okay, before I go on to that, I just wanted to say thank you for doing the in-class tests last Monday. Hopefully it wasn't quite as painful of an experience as it might have seemed, but it was clear where people had thought in advance of what you were going to talk about. Really good links made between what was in those learners' IDPs and how you'd introduce them into the session plan. So I was just saying, Jess, before you came in, I've marked the lesson plan bit of everyone's, and my job for tomorrow morning is to look at the justification part. So yeah, so well done in terms of those bits that I'd seen for that. Now the second assignment then, as we said, is due in on the 18th of May. Now this one is a little bit more straightforward in a sense, in that it is a 3,000 word essay. Okay, however, we do have 3 different titles you can choose from. Okay, you can pick any one of them. We don't have to do all 3. Doesn't matter which one you do. All of them are kind of equally good or equally bad depending upon your point of view, but hopefully there is one there that, if it isn't the better one for you, hopefully at least there is one that's the least worst. Not quite sure what's going on there. So we'll see what those look like in a second. So as a reminder, this is 3,000 words. The expectation then would be it would be underpinned with citations and references as well. So again, no right answer in terms of how many, but a kind of rule of thumb, we'd be thinking about 25 to 30 possibly separate references for a piece of work of this length. And this assignment then is worth 75% of the mark overall. So the one we did last Monday, although perhaps it's more stressful in a sense than this one, is worth 1/4 of the marks for this module. The assignment, the second one then is worth 75%. Okay. So in terms of the assignment then, you've got 3 choices that you can look at. And they've got similarities between them, but they are kind of different in terms of the overall focus as well. So what I would say, 2 of them have got ALN specifically in the title. So we need to get ALN or SEN into the title. The first one, though, we could be looking more broadly. Okay, so Agaga, for example, I know you're really interested in things like the impact of rural poverty and access to education and those kind of things. That would fit really, really well in the first option, but maybe wouldn't fit quite so well in the second or third question. Okay, so if you want to look at something that's a bit more broad, maybe that first question, critically discuss the concept of inclusion, might be the one to go for. Very sorry, this has got a mind of its own this morning. I'm not pressing anything. The other 2 have got ALN in the title, therefore we need to have an ALN focus. However, we can still broaden those out as well. Okay, so I'm just going to spend a little bit of time this morning going through what we might kind of include in these types of assignments. I don't have any examples with me today, but I'll bring some examples next week again, and we'll look at a section from each one of those types of assignments, and I'll give you the marking rubric to take a look at as well, and you can look to see about kind of areas of good practice that you pick out or things that people might have done differently. All right, so if we think about the first one then, critically discuss the concept of inclusion. Again, all sorts of ways you can go with this, but basically what we're doing here is unpicking what we mean by inclusion and what does it look like in practice. Okay, now in terms of any of these assignments, I don't have a single right answer in mind that I want you to repeat back to me. So I am open to anyone realistically taking this and running with it in whatever way makes sense to you. So I'm just going to kind of pick up on some key points which I think would be important to kind of get in there to start thinking about. But realistically, outside of that, you can tailor these in whatever way you want to look at. Okay, couple of things I wanted to say at the start as well. Although additional learning needs is the title in Wales, there is no expectation that you have to talk about. So Agagi, you're more than happy to write your assignment based on what happens in schools in Nigeria. Perfect. Okay, that's entirely fine. So we don't have to include Wales within the assignment, but you can if you want to. Equally, you can set it wherever it makes sense to you. Okay, and we've had a number of students in the past from Nigeria, Ghana, Sri Lanka, India, Indonesia, China, for example, all of whom did these assignments really successfully based on what happened in home country rather than having to think about what happens here. All right, so again, equally flows slightly closer to home, but you could base this on the English education system and talk about SEN if you wanted to, rather than ALN. All right, so the first question then asks you to think about what do we mean by inclusion. Now, we've talked about that a little bit at the start of the module. We're going to go back and pick that up a little bit today again as we go through. On Saturday, for example, I was teaching on the National Masters on an additional learning needs model, and they were looking at leading and managing ALN in Wales, and we always have a session which is called Ask the Expert, where we get somebody else from outside to come in and talk about something. And on Saturday we had Hannah Wolf, who works for Welsh Government, for example, and her role in Welsh Government is to lead on issues related to additional learning needs, for example. And she was talking about the fact that in Wales we are trying to be inclusive in terms of what we're doing in schools. So Curriculum for Wales, for example, schools can tailor and modify the curriculum to meet local need. The additional learning needs system is also meant to support inclusion. Okay, so even though we've got more and more children being taught in special schools, the aim was for more children to be in mainstream. But she noted that there are a number of inconsistencies in practice, for example, and that these are having an impact. And two of the things she talked about I think were really important because they linked back to something that we mentioned a few weeks ago, really, when we were talking about definitions. If you remember back, not that I'd expect you to remember really, but if you remember back to when we kind of defined what additional learning needs were, there was two caveats within the definition. So a learner must have a significantly greater difficulty in learning than children of the same age. And she went, well, as an organisation, we don't know what that definition is. So what do we mean by significantly greater difficulty? And the second difficulty related to definition of additional learning provision. Okay, so a child in Wales has an additional learning need if they got a significantly greater difficulty in learning than children of the same age. First of all, we don't know what that means. And secondly, if the learner is entitled to additional learning provision. And again, Welsh Government have gone, Now, we don't have a definition for what that is in practice. Okay. Just checking, Gaga, are you leaning on the screen behind you? I'm not sure if you're accidentally moving things on that screen.
I did it,
yeah. Yeah, so, all right. So, schools in Wales all do additional learning provision, but they do it differently. So, recognition in Wales that we want to be inclusive, but there's two key things that we don't have a definition for, which makes it challenging in practice. All right. So, the first one, what do we mean by inclusion, basically? Okay. And we'll pick this up together shortly again in a few minutes' time. The second one now, then, we are thinking about the environment. Okay, so how does the environment basically impact upon learners with additional learning needs or special educational needs? Okay, now again, a lot of you are interested in things outside of ALN, like poverty, like gender, for example. Those things do have an impact, but because ALN is specifically in the title for this one, we need to make sure that ALN comes through in your answer. So we could get in gender and ALN, or poverty and special needs, for example, but ALN or special needs has to be within the answer for this one. Okay, now you will have thought a bit about this, and by a bit I mean quite a lot really, looking at the session plans you did last week in terms of how the classroom environment can impact upon children. So people were talking about the things like, okay, we might need to have a sensory space for Thomas, I think it was, that was autistic, for example. Or we need to think about the structure of our classroom. So the fact that we come in here every week and the tables are in a different position wouldn't be particularly helpful if we had a visually impaired learner in class who needs to kind of learn the layout of the room, for example. Or we might be thinking about things. In Wales, a lot of our children are still taught in buildings that realistically were built in the end of the Victorian period. Okay, so the local primary school just around the corner from my house, for example, is 128 years old, the building. Okay, so it's a fab little building, but is it fit for purpose? Does it meet children's needs? Okay, so if you're looking at that second one, you're going to be thinking a little bit about the physical environment possibly. But the environment is more than just the physical environment as well. So we could be bringing in things here like the sensory environment. Okay, so I suppose that does link to the physical environment to some extent. So thinking about, like we've said before, these projectors that are going to hum in noise. The lights are either on or off. Not all the blinds close properly, so the sun comes in and blinds people at times. Okay, we've kind of got laminate flooring, so if there's people walking past, the noise carries. So there's all sorts of issues around the kind of the sensory environment as well. And also in terms of the environment, we could be thinking here as well about kind of the attitudes of people in the environment as well. So the physical space the children are taught in, the sensory environment they're taught in, and maybe kind of the attitudes of the environment that they're taught in as well. And maybe those attitudes and perceptions are different and they have an impact. And for me personally, I think those attitudes of teachers are really important. And then potentially that one also kind of links into the third one, which is thinking about the role of the educator. Okay, now I've kept the term educator here because that's quite broad. So rather than just put in teacher, for example, as many of you have got experience in a teaching assistant type role. Okay, so I would argue you have very much been in an educator capacity in schools, although it's different to the teacher. So here we could be thinking about what's the role of the teacher or teaching assistants, for example, in terms of working with children with additional learning needs. Okay, so here we could be thinking about things like, how do teachers set out their groups? So do they group by ability, for example? So you were having those discussions in your justifications about where you were going to get your learners to sit and why, for example. We might be thinking about, who does the teacher work with and who does the teaching assistant work with in class, and what impact does that have, for example. So again, we'll pick up on these things shortly. So just as a reminder again, I suppose the first one, what do we mean by inclusion basically, and what does it look like in practice? That one we can be really broad, and we can bring in all sorts of things like poverty, gender inequality, digital poverty, all sorts of things into that one. The second one, very specifically looking at ALN or SEN, but thinking about the environment. If you wanted to, you could also think about this in terms of kind of the global environment and kind of climate change and the impact that's having on children. That's going off on a slight tangent, but it does still fit into that assignment brief if that's something that you're interested in. So how is kind of climate change and degraded environments, for example, impacting on learning, and in particular children with ALN? All right. Or the third one then, thinking about the roles of teachers, teaching assistants within additional learning needs as well. And if you wanted to, realistically, we could argue that parents and family, for example, are a child's first educator. So realistically, we could also link back to kind of parental or family views about how children should or shouldn't be taught into that one as well. Okay, so as a starting point, does that kind of make sense? Okay, so all of them have kind of got inclusion as a theme going through it. One of them, inclusion generally, so we could talk about all kinds of learners. Second and third one is looking at ALN or SEN more specifically, but from slightly different points of view. And again, you can talk about this linked to any country that you wanted to. So it could be England, it could be Wales, it could be Nigeria. You could go off on a tangent and see what's happening in Singapore if you wanted to. It doesn't really matter. Okay. Now what I would say in terms of this assignment, the expectation would be that this one's written in the third person. Okay, so rather than using I, we're going to take I out of the academic writing. So it's going to be a third person written assignment. However, I think there are many places in all of these assignments where you could bring in some kind of personal reflection if you wanted to as well. So if you've talked about something, for example, Flo, you might be thinking about the environment in the PRU you're working in at the minute. There's no reason why you couldn't bring that into the assignment. Just bring it in the third person. Agaga, the same if you were doing the first assignment and you were talking about, do you know what, a classroom with 50 children, some of whom have never had access to a calculator before, compared to others where there's those kind of poverty disparities. Could you bring your own experience into that? By all means, that would work perfectly well. Okay, so generally, no right answer in terms of the assignment. Make it one that makes sense to you. All right. One final thing in terms of the assignment, okay, is in relation to Gen AI. Now, in terms of Gen AI, so either Copilot or ChatGPT, for example, are you allowed to use it? And the answer is yes and no. Okay, so kind of the same as the first one really. You can use Gen AI kind of as a tool, okay, to support in terms of the assignment. So it might be, for example, you ask Copilot or ChatGPT to find some readings for you. Or once you've written your work, you could ask ChatGPT or Copilot to check your spelling and proofread it for you and see if it has any suggestions. What you can't though do is ask Copilot or ChatGPT to write the answer for you. Okay, so just kind of bear that in mind. So it's the same guidance as the first one really. So by all means, if you want to use it as a starting point, Do you know what? A lot of people use it really well in terms of thinking about what might be an assignment structure. And you look at it and go, yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to follow that through, but I'm going to write it in my own words. Or it could be, do you know what? I've written this paragraph. It's too long. How might I shorten it? Okay, so if you want to use it, by all means use it in terms of those supportive bits, but please don't use it to write the assignment itself. And then, like we did on the in-class test on Monday, within the assignment then we will need a statement. So again, I could see many of you had put this on there. I haven't used Gen AI in terms of submitting my assignment, for example. Or if you have used it, then note what you've used it for. All right. So that was kind of the main bit I was going to say about that this morning. So before I move on slightly, anybody got any questions in terms of those bits? Now it might be, do you know what, this is due in the 18th of May, you've got 2 other assignments before then, this isn't on your radar at the moment, but I just wanted to give you enough time to start thinking and preparing, because May the 18th will come round quite quickly as well. So any particular issues or concerns in terms of the assignment or how we're allowed to do it? Does that all seem okay? Fab. Okay, so I'm going to go on to a second PowerPoint for this morning, and the first task, realistically, I should have put it on the one we've just looked at. So what we're going to talk about today, then I'm going to come back to the assignment shortly. We're going to recap some of the key debates we've mentioned in terms of ALN so far. We're going to look at models of disability. Now again, many of you, if not all of you, will have seen these before, but it's worth kind of recapping these because they do fit into all those assignment choices to some extent. Okay, so what kind of perceptions or models of need do we have influence what we think inclusion is? What perception of need a teacher has influences how they set up the classroom environment? What perception they have influences how the teacher works or supports with learners. So we're going to bring that in, and then we might not have time at the end of today, but I've put a separate PowerPoint up if you want to follow up, which is looking at person-centred planning. Now, one of the key things that has been seen as being successful in Wales is person-centred planning. In other words, trying to put the learner at the heart of what we do in schools. Okay, and you would have seen examples of that with Thomas, Daniel, and can't remember the girl's name now, last week, where you had the IDP document. So you had that one page where they had told you about themselves and what they liked, and then we had the formal document at the end talking about what their needs were. Okay, so if we run out of time this morning, as I said, I've put up some examples on the PowerPoint if you wanted to follow up in terms of how we might engage with children to kind of get their views to inform the practice that we do with them. Okay. Right, the first thing we're going to do then, as I said, I've put this QR code on the wrong PowerPoint realistically. So what I'd like us to do this morning to start off, are you happy to do this as 2 pairs? So whether Flo and Alex, you two are sitting together, Nagaga and Jess, will that be okay? So if one of you is happy to open up that QR code, I have also put it up onto Canvas if you've got This Week open on Canvas as well, for example, which is this one here, so Padlet 1. And what I'm going to ask you to do realistically is to, in your pairs, start to think a little bit about some key points. If you were going to pick those 3 essay questions, what sort of bullet points do you think might be helpful to use or might be helpful to talk about? So if we were looking at that concept of inclusion one, for example, I would say a key thing you would need to talk about would be how do we define inclusion? Because as we've seen before, we don't have one single definition. And then from there, how might you take that discussion off? In terms of the second one, I think your hair, Gaga, sorry, is knocking the screen behind you. Are you able to just move forward slightly? Thank you very much. Okay, the second one, thinking about the environment. So what do we mean by the environment? And then making those links to additional learning needs in terms of positives and negatives maybe. And then the same again for that third one. What do we mean by an educator perhaps? And how do they positively and or negatively impact upon ALN learners? Okay, so if I give you 10 minutes or so to have a think about each of those three, and then if one of you in the group is happy to post something up onto the Padlet for your peer, so we'll hopefully have 2 posts for each one in about 10 minutes time, thinking about how you might take that forward. If you've got any questions about those, pop them up on there as well. So I'll stop talking at you now and let you get on with it, but any questions, please just fire away as we're going through. Okay, I'll close the door.
Which one is more inclined? I feel like you're going to do. Possibly 2. Still, that one drawn might change my mind next time. Who knows? Yeah. When I start writing, I might change my mind. I did that with. So that's a one. Yeah. Changed my mind. So did you say 1 or 2? 2. Oh, 2. Okay. Yeah, I'm probably the same. So for the first one, identity was just like where it could be like a really warm and stuff, like considering sexual factors and class and stuff.
Then in the UK at the end of the 1970s, this one was really influential in moving away from thinking about learners as being handicapped to having special educational needs, and inclusion being seen as a common enterprise. So all children involved in learning, where everyone can learn best. The next sentence goes on to say this should be in mainstream school. And a lot of governments, I think, stopped reading at that point, because it also says if this meets the learner's needs and if this is what parents want. Okay, so realistically, there's no reason why it shouldn't be in mainstream school. But as a few of you said this morning, maybe it's not that straightforward. The UNESCO one then, so this is more of a global one. Again, I'm just going to mention the bit under the end sentence there. It's the responsibility for the regular system to educate all children. In other words, we shouldn't have special schools that separate children out and see them as being different. Regular schools should be able to do this. And you could look at that in a few ways. I suppose and go, well, yeah, okay, maybe they should. But is it possible? Is it actually appropriate in real life? Are there some learners for whom those regular mainstream schools are just not the right place for them? And my personal opinion, again, for what it's worth, is yes, there are learners who kind of fit into that. And then finally, the Welsh Government one then. So this is one that's kind of informed what's happened in ALN in Wales over the last 10 years or so. And again, I'm just going to pick on that last bit really. It's much more than placement of a child or a young person in a mainstream or special school. So just because you're in mainstream school, it doesn't mean you are included. Just because you are in a special school or a PRU, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are excluded. Although in the PRU you might have been excluded to get there, but it doesn't mean you're still excluded when you're there in practice. Okay, and then I think I've shown you this one as well, but I'm just going to kind of put this up. I quite like this one. It's quite a long-winded one, and it's also quite vintage now as well. Okay, I'm going to say it's possibly older than some of you as well. Okay, so this is from 2003. This is from the National Association of Head Teachers, so one of the kind of the education unions in the UK, and the bits that are kind of in the highlight there, I've highlighted those, but I think these bits are quite useful really. So it's a process. So it isn't something that just happens. It maximises the entitlement of all pupils. So I'm very conscious in the module we're thinking about ALN and SEN, but actually inclusion is everyone. It's boys, it's girls, it's poor learners, it's learners who have English as additional language, it's those learners who have a disability, so it's all learners. Should have access to a broad curriculum, so maybe Curriculum for Wales, for example, has had an impact in terms of that. Schools can now kind of teach their kind of localised curriculum. It's going to have an impact on learning. It's all schools. I think this next word flow goes back to what you were talking about earlier on, it's culture. Okay, we want everyone within that school to have that common ethos or culture together. If we want it to happen in practice, though, we have to give schools resources to be able to do it. Could be funding, could be training, could be physical resources. That funding, as I said, needs to be there. And I like this point as well. All pupils should be taught in the most appropriate setting. Okay, so again, I think, Flo, with some of the learners you've met, they're guaranteed there will be some there that are learning in that setting, and mainstream is never going to be the right place for those learners.
I think it's really interesting that a lot, well, not particularly this one, but the idea of inclusion, they really put mainstream settings as like high and mighty, so great, everyone enjoys mainstream. And they do.
No.
I mean, it's not the ideal location for anyone, really.
No.
Yeah.
You know, and maybe it could be, but maybe it isn't in terms of how it is done at the moment. Equally, special schools will work for some learners, but not for everyone. There will be some of those learners in the PRU with you who actually, that still doesn't work. And maybe what they need is more of a kind of vocational part-time programme. So I suppose it's kind of, you know, you've alluded to it a few times this morning, it's what's the right place for each person, and that might be different. And then again, these words we've picked out before, playing a full life in their school community. how many learners in mainstream school are pretty much invisible when they're there. They turn up for 5 years. Have they played a full life? No. Have they had the opportunity to play a full life? No. But they've been included based on the definition because they were there. Also then that sense of belonging and that sense of achievement, and we saw that sense of belonging, I think, coming through in that Ysgol y Derry video. The head teacher at the time talked about going back to culture as well. All of us are really aware of what these learners can't do. What we focus on is what they can do. And we also saw the teacher then and how they'd grouped the learners and making sure they kind of took their selfies together to feel that sense of belonging. And then when we think about achievement, again, when we think about mainstream schools, what do we think about most in terms of achievement in the UK? It's people's GCSE results, isn't it? Or A levels. Yet for how many learners are those types of assessment not appropriate? So are we also putting some learners into a setting that doesn't work for them and assess them in a way that doesn't work and gives them a qualification that doesn't work for what they want as well? Okay, probably a good time to stop and have a cup of tea at this point. So it's 11:10. If you want to start back in about 10 minutes time, will that be all right? Fab. Okay, so I'll pause the recording again. And again, we've seen this image before. If we look at things differently, then that impacts upon how we work with learners. And I think all of us, or at least some of us, we've kind of seen this story before, the giraffe and the elephant as well. Now, most of us have seen it, maybe not all of us. So I just wanted to kind of recap this one briefly. Because I think when we looked at this last time, we said this did offer quite a good analogy, really, in terms of how the education system worked and how it was set up for learners. So we talked about the fact then that the elephant may be seen as being those learners who were different in some way, including additional learning needs, and then the giraffe then being the metaphor for mainstream, kind of wider society. And Copilot did quite a nice picture for me in terms of illustrating that. So just picking out some of the things on here. I'm not going to read the story out to you, and I'm not going to ask you to read it because we've looked at it before, but it's online as well if you want to kind of see it. I've put it up on canvas. But it talked about the fact that the giraffe lived in a house that had won the Giraffe House of the Year award. It was really set up to meet the giraffe's needs, and then what they did was they invited their friend the elephant to come into their house. So very much like we've built this fantastic school to meet the needs of most learners, and look, you've got additional learning needs, we're going to invite you in, but we'd never actually thought about designing the house or school with your needs in mind. And then we see those things that kind of go wrong. So the elephant doesn't fit through the door properly, for example, and then they tell the elephant, well, do you know what, you can go and lose weight, or if you want to come into the house. Or the elephant's a little bit trying to think of the word clumsy, and they tell him, well, you can go to ballet lessons and become lighter on your feet. And so the whole emphasis and onus in the story was on the elephant to change, rather than the environment being designed to meet the elephant's needs from the start. And maybe when we're thinking between inclusion and full inclusion, for example, going back to the diagram we've seen before with the dots at the top, maybe very often what we're thinking about in terms of being inclusion is the elephant being invited into the giraffe's house, where actually when we're thinking about true or full inclusion, what we need to be thinking about is a house that's also designed with the elephant in mind as well. Okay. So again, apologise, the next few slides we've seen these before to different extents, so you might have come across the work of Crippen before. I think he's really interesting as an illustrator. So this was someone who had an accident when they were younger and became paralysed as a result of that, and since then they've made their living as kind of an illustrator, where a lot of their work comes from a disability positive perspective and tries to think about where disability fits into society. And again, we've seen this one, as I said before. I do like this image. We've got this quite well-meaning lady in the bright purple top and handbag and shoe combo there going, so what's the matter with you, dear? And then the person going, well, there's nothing really the matter with me. The only problem is your attitude. So you've been a little bit condescending. And also the problem is that there are steps rather than a ramp. But actually there is nothing wrong with me. And this comes through, I think, very clearly in the different perspectives. So the three key ones we've got, I suppose, the psychomedical model, social model, and the disability movement one. And again, each of these, I suppose, have got their own advantages and disadvantages. I think we've moved definitely away from the first one, although were there still aspects of that first one that were still useful. Probably we are very much within the second model, although we do see aspects of the third one as well. And again, depending upon different perspectives, all of these can be equally problematic in different ways. So even when we come to the rights-based one shortly, there are still aspects there that people disagree with as well. So again, just going to touch on this briefly because we've come across this before. These then were some of the main differences between these models. So the medical model realistically aimed to find out what was wrong with the person. Now, if you are ill, if you are in pain, you go to the doctor because you want them to find what the root cause is. Perfectly appropriate. However, when we're thinking about, do you know what, I've got a need in the classroom, I learn differently, potentially looking just within the person might not be the right thing to do. So we come across things here like we're looking for deficit. As I said before, we're looking at that word deviance. So if anyone's ever been tested for dyslexia, for example, all the tools will test how deviant you are from the normal population. Okay, so I think that's quite a telling word. It's not how different you are, it's how deviant you are. We see people then with a disability is broken, damaged, faulty. What we need to do is fix them in some way. Potentially we see these people as lacking mental capacity, therefore we do things on their behalf or do things to them. And if, like the elephant, we want these people to fit into society, well then they need to change and do something about it. The social model then kind of went, do you know what, nobody is disabled by an impairment. Realistically, you can have an individual impairment, but we are only disabled by it if society hasn't thought about our needs. So I might be impaired by having a visual impairment, for example. However, I am only disabled by that impairment if my environment is unfriendly and unthoughtful towards my needs. Okay, so sees difference as being part of the normal spectrum. We've come across words like neurodiversity before, which maybe takes that a step forward. And again, then thinking about these models in a little bit more detail. So again, these are all kind of Crippen diagrams I've put on here. Main problem is what's wrong with the person. What we need to do is find out what's wrong with them and fix them. And in terms of education, what we need to do is send them somewhere different to be taught separately. Okay, now this is the traditional ideology in the Western world. Key thing here towards the bottom is diagnosis. Okay, we're comparing how different or deviant the child is from what is seen as being normal. And just to pick up on what I'd said, the person from Welsh Government had mentioned on Saturday, there is no definition of what that significantly greater need is. So although that's what we're looking for, we don't know what it means in any kind of quantifiable way. Okay, so key issues with the medical model, we look to see what's wrong with the person, we give it a diagnosis, we give it a label, and then what we do is try and fix the label, or we try and teach to the label. And I like this diagram as well. When we want your opinion, we'll tell you what it is. Okay, so rather than seeing that person with agency, we do things to them. In terms of education then, the main thing we do is put people into separate classes. So increasingly we're seeing kind of specialist bases and units in schools, like we've said earlier on in Wales. Many criticisms. Okay, so it's the person that's wrong, the system is fine, it's the person that doesn't fit in, therefore there's something wrong with them. Sometimes we see it as being kind of a tick box exercise, and this is a key one, I think, towards the bottom. It's seen as letting schools and institutions off the hook. Well, do you know what? 10,000 of our learners in Swansea University can cope with this way of doing things. Why can't they? Okay, it's not our fault they don't fit in. Social model then kind of flipped that a little bit, talked about the fact that people can still have an individual difference or an individual impairment, but the problem is not the impairment, the problem is when society does not meet their needs, and in particular thinking about the built environment, but also, as many of you have mentioned this morning, that kind of social and attitudinal environment is important as well. So the key problem here is the barriers in society. So some of those learners maybe who attend a PRU or attend a special school, is it because mainstream schools don't want those pupils within their environment? Is it because they think they don't have the skills to be able to cope? So are we pushing them away rather than necessarily that being the right place for those learners? Although, as we've said earlier on, that could well be the right place for those learners. Okay, what we tend to see here is a move away from segregated education, but actually in Wales, as we've mentioned a few times this morning, we've got that paradox currently where we've seen as becoming increasingly inclusive, but we've got more children being taught in special school than before, and we've got more children being taught in special units within mainstream schools than before. So there's something not quite adding up there in terms of what's going on. Okay, there are still criticisms, so I think it's good that as a society we should look at ourselves and what we do, but a key one, it sees all people who are disabled or different in some way as being a homogenous group. So we treat all those autistic learners the same regardless of their individual needs. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to do a very brief activity now. I'm not going to ask you to post this to the Padlet. I'm going to ask you to post something else to the Padlet shortly instead. But thinking about your experiences in schools, okay, so either as somebody working in a school or as a pupil in a school, thinking about your experience in FE or higher education as well, for example. What kind of practices and attitudes have you come across which you think, you know what, really shows that kind of medical model perspective towards learners? And have you seen anything that shows more of a social model type approach? So today, as we said, we have kind of moved, at least in theory, towards that more social perspective. But in reality, have we? Or has everyone? Or are there still pockets where we see those different things? Okay, so just putting that into context, I'm an old man now. I started secondary school in 1985, which is many years before many of you were born, which is making me feel quite sick this morning. But I think I told you this story before. I started secondary school with my two best friends from primary, Martin and Christopher, and the school we went to had kind of set classes. You either went into set A, B, C, D or E, for example. So somehow me and Martin ended up going into set A, and then our friend Christopher didn't go into any of those sets. He went into a class which was called 2R, which was the 2 remedial group. So straight away we've got very old-fashioned terminology there. So this was a special class that was down the end of a locked corridor, and realistically during the school day no one saw those learners. They didn't come to mainstream lessons, they didn't come to assemblies, they didn't come to sports days, for example. So the only time we saw Christopher in 5 years that he was in that secondary school was outside of school. Okay, so very much that's seen as being separate and different. However, today we could also still argue that that was positive. How many of you have kind of seen schools, for example, which have kind of got special units for learners who've got kind of school anxiety or are experiencing trauma, where again they might be in school but are kind of slightly separate from everyone else? Okay. So I think all of these, when we look at them, it's quite easy to see all of these things as being negative, but maybe there are kind of flip sides for all these as well. All right, so I'm just going to pick on Jess because you happen to look at me then, Jess. So anything that you can think of in terms of that where you've seen those different approaches in practice?
There's definitely some in there. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Think of any right now. It's going to come to me when, like, in 2 minutes.
Fair enough, I'll come back to you then. Ogaga, so thinking about your experiences in schools in Nigeria, okay, possibly different to how things are in the UK, I don't know. Anything you could share in terms of how you've seen those different ways children are perceived or thought about? So in Nigeria, for example, are learners who've got special needs, are they seen as being a problem? Are they seen as being lesser? Are they treated differently? What anything you can share in terms of your experiences there?
The system is entirely different.
Okay. And what way is that system different, Ogaga?
In the aspect of the technology.
Okay.
Here in the UK, we mostly use technology automatic. Then in Nigeria, students prefer using this
Okay.
instead of computers.
Okay, so very different in terms of ways of teaching.
The teaching pattern is different.
Okay. And in what, I'm just going to ask the question again, so in what way is that teaching different?
I would say here in the UK, the teacher elaborates more.
Okay.
They elaborate more, they go into more details to make sure the students understand what they are teaching. Then in my country it's entirely different. It's a different system entirely. The teaching pattern is different.
Okay.
The learning pattern is different.
Okay. Thank you, Agar. And then would that be the same then for all learners in Nigeria, depending upon needs, or would it be different for some again?
It's entirely different from we have a private school and a public school, which is a government school. The government school is a bad.
Okay.
The system there, their learning system is entirely different from those attending private school. Like me in my country, I attended a private school. So I think the learning system is different because we in the private sector, in the private school, we have access to digital learning, technologies. Then those in the government school not have those assets.
Thank you very much. So going back to that kind of concept of inclusion, maybe those learners who can't afford, for example, to attend the private school, they will miss out on certain opportunities, so they are kind of excluded or segregated as a result of poverty or finance rather than need. Brilliant. Thank you very much for sharing. You thought now, go for it then, Jess.
I've seen with I do supply teaching and stuff.
Yeah.
In most schools, I'll go in and I'm what's this area of need for this child?
Yeah.
And they're we're waiting for a diagnosis. He's waiting for his IDP.
Okay.
And I feel support gets delayed until there's a label on it, a medical label.
That's a good point, yeah. And funding and stuff.
Literally.
Yeah.
Until you have a diagnosis, children won't get helped.
No, I thought I'd put it up on there, but no, I think you're right. Yeah, so realistically, I was trying to find a slide where I'd put something like that on to back up what you've just said, but I can't find it. So there is that, even in Wales currently, people have talked about, well, do you know what, we might be being more inclusive, but still support doesn't happen until learners get the diagnosis, because that triggers funds, for example. So what do we do with those learners whilst we're waiting for that diagnosis to happen? So are they missing out on support? Do we know they need support but we don't put anything into place because we don't know what to do, because we haven't been told what support is needed? Do we need some kind of technology or person to help that learner, but it becomes with funding that's based on the diagnosis? So again, that's a key issue, I'd say, in many parts of the world, but that's something, Jess, that's being noted in Wales with the new system. There is still that expectation in many schools that we can't do anything until that funding comes in based on that label. So thank you for sharing that, Jess. Flo.
I've had similar experiences as Jess as well, through there's they kind of have a class that are more social emotional, they're more emotionally vulnerable children.
Okay.
But they've been sent out of school because of their challenging behaviour, and none of them are formally diagnosed. But me and the teachers were talking, these children, their diagnosis has been looked over because their behaviour is so challenging.
Yeah.
And the longer they stay in those schools, the worse behaviours they pick up.
Yeah.
And it's kind of that comorbidity of some children, when they're so traumatised, they present behaviours that look very similar to severe autism. So there's almost not enough. It's the waiting game of waiting for those diagnoses, or to see which has caused which, or whether it's a cycle and they keep. So and where they prioritise the behaviour, or do they prioritise learning different. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And when they're strapped with resources, like, it really doesn't help at all.
No.
Yeah.
No, that's a really interesting one. Thank you for sharing that as well. And it's kind of to know what the behaviour is challenging to us, therefore that becomes our priority rather than understanding why. And we don't take the time potentially to understand the why, because we have to deal with the behaviour. And as you've said, very often that just means being kind of pushed out and going to the next place. Thank you very much, Flo. And finally, Alex, any thoughts, any experiences in terms of that?
Still going on the support being given after diagnosis. From a more personal point of view, I've seen it with my siblings. So I've got two who are medically diagnosed with autism, and my younger sister is still undiagnosed.
Okay.
I've sort of seen, once my siblings had their diagnosis, the support we put in place for them through school, through uni. And my youngest sister, who's undiagnosed, like, she's got, the only thing she's got currently is like a 5-minute class, a neat class for lunch, because she struggles with the canteen because it's so busy. It's a really large school where she goes. She doesn't like the noise and the crowding. She wants to sort of get her lunch and sit on her own. But even that's not really helping, because she still has to sit in the canteen to eat. So even though she's there before everyone else still files in after. And it's like, what, like, we really want the school to help, but obviously. Yeah, it's hard. We're hoping to get her diagnosis.
Okay. So with the diagnosis, potentially the school would be able or willing to put the support in place, but without the diagnosis, they've kind of gone, well, this is all we can offer until we get told more. Yeah, and as a parent, as a family member, that's really challenging, because the school probably already knows what they should be doing, but they won't. Because it comes with financial constraints or whatever it might be till that diagnosis comes in.
It's really hard because she refuses to eat at school at the moment.
Yeah.
She struggles so much. We can't afford to send her in with packed lunches all the time.
No.
We'd love to, because then she'd be able to sit somewhere else and eat. And she refuses at school, and it's what can we do?
Yeah, so thank you for sharing that. That's a really personal one. That's very illustrative as well, in terms of it's not just the learning environment in school that can be a barrier, it's all those other bits that go around it as well. So potentially perfectly fine in class and learning wise all going okay, but that, building up to lunchtime every day is going to be stressful. Lunch is going to be stressful. What impact does that have in terms of afternoons as well? Coming home not having eaten during school, how does that impact upon family time? So something that could or should be a relatively simple fix, if fix is the right word, but not being put into place because that diagnosis isn't there yet. No, so thank you very much for sharing. So, conscious of time, so just to kind of summarise then, again, apologies, we've seen this before, main difference between the medical model and the social model. Medical model, the person is at fault, there's something wrong with them, and what we're going to do is send them somewhere different because they're different. The social model, people are just different, they're not damaged or faulty, and what we need to do is remove some of the barriers that we have to support these children to come into our settings. Okay. There are also other models like the affirmative model. So we saw this a little bit maybe over the last couple of weeks, where we've had the Winter Paralympics, which perhaps didn't quite get the coverage like the Paralympics or the Summer Olympiad has had in the past. So I think there was quite a lot of this affirmative model of disability we saw during London 2012, for example. All sorts of things talking about these superhuman athletes. If anyone watches The Last Leg on Channel 4, for example, that's kind of came out as being something very specific to them, to the Paralympics, but focusing upon the individual's strengths. Okay, so recognising difference is a good thing. So again, I like this diagram. Normality training, how to stop upsetting people by looking disabled. And then we've got these two people there, be normal, why do you think we'd want to lower our standards? So a recognition that in society difference is a good thing, and rather than normalising disability, what we're doing is embracing it instead. And then finally we got kind of the rights-based model, which kind of says, well, if society isn't willing to change on its own, then we need to force that to happen, and that could be through legislation or financial fines, for example. Now, I'm just going to mention this briefly, and then we will stop for today. So thinking about rights-based within education, we've seen before, UNCRC, all children have a right to an education. The UNCRPD, all children with disabilities have a right to an inclusive education. But the problem, as you've all said this morning, how do we define that? A lot of people talked about themselves as being special school survivors. In other words, I was sent somewhere different and I survived it. Equally, as you've said this morning, Flo, how many people are mainstream school survivors? They got through mainstream school just about, rather than being supported and thriving through it. Okay, point number 4, there are no legitimate reasons to separate children for their education. Do we agree or disagree with that? Are there legitimate reasons why some learners can't or shouldn't be together? Maybe that's open to debate. Okay, research does show that children do better in inclusive settings. However, as we've said before, does inclusion just mean mainstream? Will there be those learners with you, Flo, who will absolutely thrive and achieve because they are somewhere different, whilst they would be increasingly excluded and disengaged if they stayed in mainstream, for example? Okay. And then again, some of you have seen this slide before as well, and it's made me think to some extent over the last few weeks as well. So when we thought about the rights and affirmative base just now celebrating disability, Tom Shakespeare, who you might have come across before, as a disability advocate, and I think this is a really interesting point of view as well. So he's talking about something slightly different, but the role of disability politics should be to make impairment and disability irrelevant. So rather than thinking about that person as being different and to know what that difference could be beneficial and powerful, actually we should just stop seeing people as being different altogether. If we're seeing people as being that kind of superhero or having that superpower, we're still focusing on difference. So maybe we should stop doing that at all. Okay. I've put some further readings up on here. These are all available through iPad if there's anything you want to, not iPad, iFind. If there's anything you want to follow up, you can iFind it on your iPad if you want to. And just check in terms of your other modules, have you got any bits of coursework or things going on over the next week? Okay. Okay. Bearing that in mind then, would you mind if I set you a bit of a finding out task to bring with you on Monday? And you can use AI to help you with this one, okay? So what we didn't get a chance to do today, because I spent too long talking about something else at the start, was thinking about comparing and contrasting practice in different countries and kind of putting them on a continuum from least to most inclusive. So what I'm going to ask you to do, if you don't mind, is just to find a bit of information. You don't have to print it off or anything like that, but if you can bring it with you next Monday, then we can kind of talk about it and see where it goes. So I'm going to give you all 2 countries each that I want you to find out a little bit about. Okay, and as I said, you can just stick this question into Copilot if you want and see what it tells you, but just check on it before you bring it with you next week. Okay, so Jess, I'm going to give you India and China. So what does inclusion look like in those 2 countries? Okay, Ogaga, I'm going to give you Nigeria because I want to find out more about Nigeria, and I'm also going to ask you to find some information about South Africa. Yeah, so what does inclusion look like in Nigeria and what does inclusion look like in South Africa? Okay. Flo, I'm going to send you to South America. So you're going to do Chile and you're going to do Ecuador. And Alex, do you want to do North America or Europe? Yeah, there we go. I'm going to send you to North America and you're going to see what inclusion looks like in America and Canada. Okay. At least in bits. Yeah.